you in to talk about today and how we got to this point, and I guess kind of even think about, is it possible that we can get out of this mess that we're in?
I think it's totally possible to get out of the mess we're in. And I think what I can talk about is the way that I think over 95% of poultry is produced in the United States, which is in this highly centralized, highly technological, industrialized model. And like really quick to give the very quick history, back in the late 1920s, chicken was kind of a luxury food. It was kind of like lobster. And when the politician Huey Long was talking about a chicken in every pot, he meant people are going to be prosperous. I mean, that's how chicken was viewed. And raising chickens in the South was still done as sort of a side business on farms. You'd have a chicken coop, you'd raise birds, you'd sell eggs at market. But these group of people came along in the late 20s and started trying to figure out how to really mass produce chickens, like as if they were an industrial product. And race ahead, they started experimenting with these big barns that were heated, that were ventilated. They started inventing these automated feeding systems. And a few of these people started to put together these conglomerates where they started to orchestrate activity between the farm and the slaughterhouse and the trucking lines that could deliver it. And this model is called vertical integration, where one company owns all the different aspects of poultry production. And, even up until the 40s and 50s, when you had a town that produced a lot of chicken, all of these different parts of the business were owned by local business people. You had a local slaughterhouse, you had a local trucking company, you had a local feed mill, you had dozens or hundreds of local farmers raising the birds. But the real insight of these early industry pioneers like Don Tyson was that if they could own every piece of the business, they could orchestrate it to maximum efficiency. And that's exactly what they did. The Tysons in Arkansas bought a slaughterhouse, they bought a feed mill, they actually bought a lot of chicken farms, they built their own chicken farms, and they built and started to operate their own trucking line. And so over the decades, what they could do is mass produce these animals like as if they were widgets on a factory floor and just produce them to the specifications of a certain customer, like a big grocery store chain or later a restaurant, a fast food restaurant. They could grow exactly the kind of bird that was needed at exactly the right size and the right kind of meat. And they created like a tremendously industrial efficient system of raising birds. But the key is again that they own the whole process from top to bottom. Vertically integrated means one corporation owns everything. So all of the wealth produced by this business would stay inside the corporation. And sorry, I'll shut up here in a second, but the key thing is that these guys like Don Tyson, primarily in the southeastern United States, started to produce these massive corporations. And then they figured out how to get money by going public on Wall Street. They developed relationships with banks. They borrowed a lot of money. They started making millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. And in the 1990s, these companies started to go on this merger spree and buy each other out. And so that dramatically consolidated ownership into a few hands, whereby today, like two chicken companies control half the national market. That's Tyson and JBS operating under the name Pilgrim's Pride. And so what you see is this very tightly controlled corporate production system that treats the animals like pieces of machinery that are deeply tied in with retailers like Walmart, with food operations like McDonald's, and to race ahead to the end, it's a pretty extractive industry. Farmers in that industry operate under a contract. Most of the profits go to the company. A great deal of the risk is shifted to the farmer. The companies own one of the most profitable parts of the whole business, which is the genetics of the chickens. They own the genetics, they develop the genetics, And so you see these companies like Tyson earning billions in profits a year while farmers are struggling to pay the bills every month.
Why own everything except the buildings?
Okay, so that's a great question. And that really perplexed me in the beginning because in the beginning, companies like Tyson, and I talk about Tyson a lot because they were like the pioneer of this model and they became the biggest. But in the early days, companies like Tyson, like I said, they built their own farms, they owned their own farms, but they had this realization in about the 1940s and 1950s that the least profitable part of this chain to own is the farm. First of all, most of the risk is located on the farm, and that's the risk of the animals getting sick and the animals dying. If you raise cattle, you're familiar with those risks. The animals are in nature, basically. At the same time, the company realized that buying up all the land that was necessary to build out the farms it would need would just be almost prohibitively expensive. They would have had to borrow and put most of their money into buying land. So they came up with this ingenious system whereby they encouraged nominally independent farmers to buy the land, to borrow money to put up these chicken factories. That's really what they are. They call them chicken houses, but these are multi-million dollar facilities with really technological equipment inside. And so they would convince these farmers to buy the land, borrow the money to put up the chicken factories, and then raise the animals under contract with the company. And critically here, the companies in this case, they own the animals the entire time. The farmer never even owns the animal, and the farmer never sells the animal. They just raise them under contract with the company. And in essence, what the companies realize is that using this contract system, they could grow much more quickly than if they had to build their own farms. And at the same time, they could induce a group of farmers to come into the system and raise animals for them while still managing to control every aspect of production on that farm. And I will say there was another critical example is I interviewed this guy named James Blair, who was the general counsel at Tyson Foods, the top attorney, close of friends with Don Tyson, and he was actually the architect of many of these contracts. And he said the company realized early on that if you keep farmers under contract, and you structure it so that the contracts are maybe for a year or 6 months, and the farmer is forced to pay a mortgage of 30 years. It is the best possible way to keep farmers essentially under your thumb. As they would put it, highly, highly motivated to do the kind of 7-day work week that's necessary to raise birds. But these contracts keep the farmers linked into the system, needing that next contract, needing to earn the money, and working as hard as they can to stay in business.
I guess though, because I guess asking the farm to, I mean, why not have them then own the birds too? Because that is a big risk about, they might die. So why have them, why not unload that on farmers too? Or is that just too unpalatable?
Well, Beth, I'm not kidding here. There's a clause in the contract that ownership of the bird shifts to the farmer when the bird dies. So they figured that part out too. So they own the birds as long as the birds are alive, and they collect the living birds and weigh them and pay the farmer based on how much weight the bird gained, based on how much food it ate. But when the bird dies, it's up, ownership shifts to the farmer, and the farmer has to figure out how to dispose of the bird. Although in many cases, the the company will come collect the dead birds, I think for a fee. It kind of depends on the contract. But the contracts are really brilliantly designed. Um, Tyson owns the birds. The farmer owns the manure, which in many cases is a benefit because you can use manure to fertilize fields. But these factories produce manure at such a giant scale that it's actually a pollutant. There's way more manure producing can be used on fields unless you own an enormous farm. So the farmer has to figure out how to dispose of the waste in the form of the manure. The farmer has to accept losses on dead birds. The farmer has to accept losses on sickness. If the birds get sick somehow and don't eat a lot and don't gain weight, the farmer pays for that by getting paid less. And the reason it's structured this way is it's all about bargaining power. The companies design the contracts in their interest, like any human would design a contract to benefit them as much as possible. And to understand why farmers would sign this, it's really all about the dynamics of bargaining power. And that is a question I get a lot is, why are these contracts structured to the benefit of the company so much over the farmer? It's because, contracts are a result of bargaining power, plain and simple. And in many cases, Tyson is building these enormous chicken plants, and so are the other companies, Pilgrim's Pride, George's, or whatever. They're building these plants in towns where there's not a ton of opportunity, where the agricultural market, as you know, can be very up and down. It's hard to make a living. They find people who want to really stay in these communities, and they're offering them what they're presenting is like the best chance to stay in the community in the form of this contract. So farmers more or less are eager to take these contracts to stay into business and stay in business, but the companies design them definitely to the company's benefit.
And is that similar with layers too? It's basically the same scenario because Iowa's number one in eggs, and I wonder how comparable the scenarios are.
From what I've seen, and I haven't written extensively about the layer market, but it is identical to what the chickens raised for food are called broilers. And basically the structure of the broiler industry and the pullet or egg laying industry are totally identical. And in many cases, Tyson for broilers will have farms that do nothing but lay eggs to go to the hatchery, and those contracts are exactly identical. And the big egg companies like Cal-Maine pattern themselves after this model that was pioneered by the broilers. So every egg laying every farmer I've ever talked to, they're in an identical situation. It's like the industry standard now.
And hogs, same.
Well, can I talk about that for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, so in the up from the 1940s to the 1970s, the chicken industry just explodes and becomes enormously profitable. And that's because of the industrialization I talked about that makes the meat cheaper, cheaper, cheaper. And this is the era when we start to see chicken becoming a major menu item on fast food restaurants. I mean, in the 40s, you had burger joints. But Tyson and others were able to make chicken so cheaply that we had the chicken sandwich and the chicken nugget and all these meats that start penetrating in. Okay. So these chicken companies are getting vast. They've got literally billions of dollars in cash. And they notice that the hog market is this tremendously profitable industry. Up in Iowa, where you are, I interviewed hog farmers who, in the 50s and 60s, the hog was known as the mortgage lifter. In other words, if you had hogs and raised hogs that made enough money, you could pay off the mortgage. I met a guy who was put through law school on hog farm money. And hogs at that time were owned entirely by independent producers who sold them entirely into open and competitive bidding markets. There were hog barns and auction barns along the sides of the highway in Iowa and so forth. And there was a ton of money to be made. So literally, these chicken companies started to experiment and they figured out how to raise hogs as they were raising chickens. Tyson built this experimental hog farm down in Holdenville, Oklahoma, where they figured out how to raise hogs in these giant factory-like barns, just like chickens. And that's not how hogs were raised at the time. Hogs still had access to outdoor areas. They would forage and so forth, the way you think about a hog being raised on a farm. But these companies figured out the modern confined animal feeding operation for hogs. And there were a bunch of companies doing this, like Tyson was doing it, Premium Standard Farms, Smithfield Foods. They kind of all raced into this market at the same time, and they borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars from banks and from Wall Street and started building the first network of factory vertically integrated hog operations starting in the 1990s. You probably remember this. I remember this when these huge hog farms started popping up in Iowa, northern Missouri at this time. They were all financed by these big corporations. And what happened over 20 years is that the independent hog market was swallowed up by this vertically integrated industrialized model. And, at the time in the 80s, over 95% of hogs were sold on an open market. Now I think it's something like 5% or fewer. And the rest of these hogs are now raised under contract. Uh, I'm sorry, the rest of these hog farmers now raise the hogs under contract. And I call it the great chickenization because that's a word that gets thrown around among meat producers in rural America is chickenization. And what it means is the vertical integration and the imposition of contract farming on a business. And so the hog business got completely chickenized in the 90s and the 2000s so that now it resembles the chicken industry in many respects.
Hmm. So why do farmers do it?
You know, it, it's a great question. This is my best answer. And I have been reporting on this for a long time. What I found is that as a rule, the people who enter contracts like this, I have found two groups of people. The first are people who are born and raised in a rural area, maybe third or fourth generation. They remember the town they grew up in. They're very tied into their community. They love where they live. They love the quality of life. But in many of these communities, they've seen the economic opportunity diminish over time as you know, the retail sector consolidates under a Walmart, as a lot of factories might close, as we see the agricultural industry get more consolidated, as we see farms get bigger. And what happens is you have a large industrial meat company come to town, and they might be producing chicken or hogs under contract. And what they're offering to farmers is what these companies present as like a stable living. And the pitch is basically as follows. Hey, if you borrow $2.5 million and build this facility, we will give you steady work under contract. You can count on us. You'll have absolutely dependable supply of animals. And here's what the contract's going to look like. You'll be able to pay off your mortgage. And the prospect of being able to stay on the land and farm is just tremendously appealing to the group of people I just described who've been born and raised in an area and want to stay there. The second group that's really interesting would be immigrant farmers. In Arkansas, for example, Laotian and Hmong immigrant communities started hearing about the opportunity to raise animals under contract, and they started moving to these tiny towns like Waldron, Arkansas, or Berryville, Missouri. And to them, it was that stepping stone into the American dream. And a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia or elsewhere have an agricultural tradition of their own. And so they're very familiar with this lifestyle. And so they enter it. And, basically, it's this promise of being able to farm and having a steady income that draws people in. And I know I sound here a little bit cynical and a little bit biased, but what I'm telling you is time and time and time and time again, I've seen that the upfront promises are just empty. I can't tell you how many, I mean, dozens or hundreds of farmers that I have personally interviewed that got into the deal and then found out it was not what was advertised. There are multiple mechanisms that these companies use to make sure that the farmers are kind of always one step behind. And this is important to the model because the farmers need to remain quote unquote motivated. And here's one example. Companies will require that these farmers upgrade the facilities. Okay, that's not advertised in the beginning, but they'll come back after 5 years and say, hey, you need to borrow an additional $75,000 to upgrade the fans, to upgrade the feed lines, to upgrade the computer system. And that's enforced on the farmer through contract. And so now it's a take it or leave it proposition. And so the farmer has to take on more debt. All of a sudden, that moment where they're paying off the mortgage gets further down the road, and they remain stuck in this contract system. That is not a few one-off examples. That is systemic to the industry.
And what about, I heard recently, and this was kind of came out of out of actually the grain world, like hearing people, there was an example of this group that was trying to grow oats, and they um they brought their oats in, and then they were told, oh, these oats, after they waited a really long time, oh, they're contaminated, and they were turned around. And then I talked to someone who does contracts, the farm commons, that group. Anyway, they do all
Oh,
sorts of like legal stuff with farmers. They can provide like leases and contracts and stuff. Um, and they told me that they've been seeing this a lot where these industries now, be it grain or chickens or whatever, are contracting for way, way more than they need and then denying the contract when it comes due. Like there's something wrong with the birds are testing for this disease, that thing has contamination with GMOs or whatever kinds of problems. Have you heard anything about that side of this?
okay, on two fronts. First of all, to be totally blunt, I have not heard of what you just talked about sort of over contracting and getting an oversupply and then canceling at the end. That is very fascinating, and I haven't been reporting a lot lately in this field, so I haven't heard about that specific thing. I could talk a little bit about what I definitely have seen over a long period of time, which is that, you're talking about farmers raising meat or crops under contract. And the thing that strikes me time and time again is that contract arrangements are a manifestation of bargaining power. That's it. And so what we're seeing across sectors in agriculture is tremendous consolidation of processing and of ownership that's happening. The farms are consolidating, but most of this is happening on the processing and corporate level. But what that means, particularly in the poultry business, is that farmers are really limited with who they can do business. There are many, many, many communities where there's only one major poultry processor to do business with. And that means that the power is all in the hands of the company. And, those kind of examples you mentioned, I've seen them countless times whereby, the company will weigh the animals, tell the farmer what they weigh, and then it'll later be discovered that the weights were faulty and that the farmer got underpaid. Um, the company will shorten contracts on unilateral notice. The company will require more debt to be taken on to upgrade facilities. On and on it goes. And it's basic human dynamics. The companies are going to do what they can do to maximize their profits. That's what corporations do. But when farmers don't have bargaining power, because the industry is so consolidated, they're really limited in what they can do.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point because people, you think about a contract like, oh, well, I'm solidifying it. I know what I'm doing and I know what I get. But really, when you don't have any power, there's little to say about it if it doesn't turn out as you thought the contract said.
And this is where I take great issue with the field of agricultural economics and like ag extensions at universities is, God bless economists. They help us a lot and they can help us see the world. But I just have seen this again and again. Economists will talk about contract farming within the context of just efficiency and economic models and economic theory, and they never take power into account. And we don't even need to talk about power in an abstract sense. Let's just talk about it in terms of bargaining power with industry consolidation. When you can only do business with one company, that company has just a tremendous amount of bargaining power over you. And so I think that that aspect of it and the aspect of consolidation and monopoly power for decades was totally ignored in this country. And it's starting to get a lot more attention now that we've gotten to this really incredible place of corporate consolidation. I mean, I read a lot of history about this, and back in the 1920s, there was the so-called meat trust, back in the Upton Sinclair era of the jungle and, the trust busting days under FDR. The industry is more consolidated now than it was back in the meat trust days. Fewer companies have more ownership, and now they have this incredible power from top to bottom through vertical integration. And we're seeing the negative effects of this all across the industry, from farmers who are getting put out of business to major retailers like Walmart that are getting gouged because the poultry companies are colluding with each other to jack up prices. This has been shown in civil litigation, Department of Justice investigations, and the concentration has just reached a level now where this discussion of power dynamics is finally breaking into the mainstream. What's really sad to me is that these issues weren't considered back in the 90s and the 2000s when we were just racing to let these companies merge with each other, you know?
Yeah, I think that the benefit of cheap food has kind of clouded everything, right? Like I was just talking to another rancher about this idea of, solving the problem that is happening right now with American beef of having this like small stocks, and so the price has gone up. And like, who is that a real problem for? It's all based on consumer prices. It has nothing to do with the fact that, oh, finally now cattle ranchers are actually making what they probably should have been making all along. So we've got to solve the quote unquote problem by flooding the market with cattle and putting the farmer kind of back in their place of not making anything.
Totally. Okay. If I could, like, I'm a geek about antitrust law, and antitrust law is what keeps markets competitive and helps out producers like farmers and consumers. And back in the 40s, we had this theory that we needed to have a lot of competition, so there was a competitive market which worked to the benefit of farmers without question. Look at the hog market. But a new theory came about in the 80s that was called the consumer welfare theory. And this theory went, as long as the food's getting cheaper at the grocery store, we do not care if these companies consolidate. We don't care about consolidation anymore. I'm oversimplifying, to be clear, but not that much. What they were saying was, as long as you can prove you're making the food cheaper, we don't care nearly as much about how consolidated the market gets. But the problem is that once you allow markets to become super concentrated, companies gain monopoly power, and the playbook for monopolies has never changed. It's always the same. When you get market power, you underpay your producer, which is the farmer, you underpay them, and then you overcharge the consumer, and you grab the profits in the middle. And so in the cattle industry, we have seen four companies merge at the slaughterhouse level, at the processor level. Incidentally, as a side note, they've never been able to vertically integrate cattle. It just doesn't work technologically. And I can talk about why, but it just doesn't work. So they've only been able to consolidate at the slaughterhouse level. And we now have four companies control 65% of the market, but they have basically cartel-like buying power in many communities, where you've got all these ranchers, but they'll only have, two or one or two major processors in their area to sell to. If they're lucky, they'll have three. And so the companies can bargain down the price they pay to ranchers. And so the key here is that you can have ranchers struggling to get by, even when beef prices start to rise, or even when beef prices are moderate. The real profits are getting captured at that slaughterhouse level and then down through the value chain to the Walmart or what have you, to the retailer. And it's just fascinating that basically when you have consolidation at the processor level, the profits are going to get captured by the middleman, which is the slaughterhouse and the retailer, between the ranch and the kitchen. And so you'll have years and years go by where the profits are, captured there. These companies are making billions. Ranchers might be doing okay. It goes up and down. Because, like you're saying, you'll have a moment now where cattle prices are really high or have been really high. And finally, the ranchers getting some money, which can help offset what they've been investing for years or the lean years that they've had. And, it's just much to the benefit to put it all on the cattle rancher instead of looking at the processor level is what I think.
Yeah. So how might we undo it? It sounds like you're
Okay.
alluding to antitrust, but I guess I'd like to hear about that, but then other ideas too.
Okay. My biggest thing is antitrust enforcement, vigorous antitrust enforcement. Tyson Foods should be broken apart, and so should JBS, and so should Smithfield Foods. These companies were allowed to merge under bad policy in the 90s and 2000s, and it has not worked out to the benefit of the farmer, and it has not worked out to the benefit of the consumer, and it was a public policy choice to do it. And the reason I keep coming back to antitrust reform is because there's only so much consumers can do. I mean, I love the local farmers market, and you're seeing a really vibrant market now of boutique cattle producers selling directly to consumer or selling through a local farmers market. It's excellent. But when you look at the main meat production in the United States that the vast majority of people are consuming from, it's this monopolized market, and it's totally dysfunctional. The profits are getting captured by these corporations, farmers aren't getting the money, and consumers are paying too much. And you can't really solve a monopolistic problem like that just at the consumer level. I mean, we can all try to spend our dollars on local food, and that's great. But the problem with monopolies is that the old laws of capitalism, of supply and demand and consumer choice, don't really work anymore. Because, just to take a small example, I mean, you can go into the grocery store and see 12 different brands of beef, and they're owned by like two companies. You don't really have consumer choice. So we need antitrust enforcement on the federal level to restate competition into this market to the benefit of farmers and consumers, particularly so that farmers have more competition for their goods. I think that that would stoke a lot more quality meat. It would put a lot more wealth into rural communities, and it would benefit consumers. It would benefit consumers. Um, Barring that, the actual antitrust enforcement we need, I don't want to I don't want to undersell the fact that, the two examples you talked about at the beginning, we're seeing a lot of just really smart entrepreneurs in rural America pushing into a different model. You know, I've seen poultry companies that are started under a co-op model where the farmers own the processor. Um, you're seeing a lot more direct from farm to consumer sales. There's a really smart cattle outfit called Merriweather Farms that sells directly to consumers, and they advertise over the internet and they advertise on podcasts, and they're kind of developing a national buyer base. It's kind of one of the bigger examples I've seen of something like that. So you're seeing these entrepreneurial alternatives to the monopoly market, and that's great. I do think for the vast majority of people who depend on meat and the vast majority of farmers who raise under this monopolistic system, the only answer is a public policy approach of antitrust reform to to restore competition. And if I could I say one quick thing about antitrust, it's farmers tend to hate it because it's federal regulation, it's federal government, it's the strong arm of government. And like I get that. What's so unique about antitrust law is it's using the power of the federal government to restore competition to capitalistic markets. And when we did strong antitrust enforcement in the 40s and 50s, it maintained competition. It actually restored competition to rural areas, And it just helped create so much wealth. I mean, when I was talking about the hog market, it was a vigorous and vital market populated by independent producers that produced really high quality meat. We had all these vigorous competitive auctions and open price discovery for pork. Competition is a great thing. And unfortunately, if you leave capitalism to its own devices, it always kind of wants to revert to this monopoly model that's not great for farmers or consumers. So actually, the painful paradox is that strong federal antitrust reform can increase competition and capitalistic freedom. That's the paradox of it.
What about though, you talked a lot about um bargaining power. Is that just out of, I mean, there's been so few farm movements at the farmer level that have been able to capitalize on it, on any kind of power to in the farmer, in the numbers of farmers. But I wonder if you could speak about that a little. Is there any hope in that?
You know, you're making me think of this age-old problem in both markets and in public policy, which is that the concentrated special interest has a huge advantage over the broad-based public interest of all these people out there, millions of people just trying to live their lives who aren't going to be as like deadly focused in on an issue as the multi-million-dollar corporation that profits from it. And when you're talking about bargaining power with farms, when you've got three or four massive corporations that are dominating a market, they're on point every day and they are very well resourced and they have a ton of money. They have lobbying operations in DC. They've got buildings full of lawyers. And then on the other side of the equation, you've got millions of food producers scattered through rural communities all over the country who are just normal people trying to live their lives, trying to make a living. And they're at a disadvantage when it comes to organizing and, developing some kind of organization that could have bargaining power. Or even lobbying lawmakers is extraordinarily hard for independent farmers. And and that's or just it's just this like basic dynamic in American society that explains why special interests can win every day on the policy level. And it's tough to mitigate, but it's not an impossible problem because mass democratic movements are like tremendously powerful. And we've seen them operate again and again. I mean, the reason we had strong antitrust enforcement in the 40s was because there were these huge political movements in rural communities and of the farmers to push for their interests. I don't know how you can kind of try to recreate that today. It's super difficult.
Well, it's been confusing too, and I don't know if you have anything to say on this front, but like, how does it end up that organizations of farmers, the Farm Bureau, the Soy Growers Association, the Corn Growers Association, how did those groups end up acting almost more in the interests of the companies than they do of those farmers? I never have understood how that they kind of split teams at some point.
Uh, that's like the multi-trillion dollar question. I mean, particularly with, organizations I'm not as familiar with, like the American Farm Bureau and the Soybean Association. In terms of the meat industry, I can say that like the National Chicken Council and the Pork Growers Association were essentially started by the corporations. And they're not started by the farmers. And you
Wait, what do
know,
you mean essentially started? Like they were started literally by the companies?
the National Chicken Council was the the American Meat Institute was started by the companies. The National Chicken Council was too. The pork growers is the one that's actually That's why I said essentially. I think the pork growers might have started independent and fallen into the orbit of the producers. I know that the National Chicken Council represents the interests of the integrators, as the companies are called, not really the farmers.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, this sounds like a really oversimplistic answer, but it's all about the concentration of wealth. I mean, when you start getting huge concentrations of wealth, it buys political power. And again, farmers tend to be independent and more isolated and more kind of fractured as a group, whereas the companies are very concentrated, very focused, and very on point. So, they can give a lot more money to an industry group. They can have a lot closer relationships. They can spend a lot more time targeting that interest group. And so you could kind of see how over time they start to fall into the orbit of the money.
Yeah.
It really is just a dynamic of concentrated wealth versus public democratic energy. And it's the difficulty of people kind of uniting on a common platform to pursue their interest versus very concentrated wealth pursuing its own interests.
Yeah.
But, you're asking specifically about these farm organizations, and I don't know specifically. I mean, I do know that the National Chicken Council is just a company front group, no doubt about it. So is the American Meat Institute or the North American Meat Association. But to me, it's just the broader effect of high concentrations of wealth begin to make gravity of political power around them.
Right. Right. Wait, hold on one second. I want to just
Okay.
grab like so this is something just on that front. Today I was looking at, in preparation of all of this, I was thinking about how much money is there in the poultry business, right? And I found this thing, it was on like the Egg Council, or I don't remember what kind of um it was actually, it was about meat. It wasn't about eggs, but it said something like the entire chicken industry, the chicken industry pays 137, so let's say 140 billion dollars, and it's to 2 million plus jobs. So 140 billion to 2 million plus jobs. And Zuckerberg is worth $222 billion,
Yeah.
more than the jobs of 2 million people, almost twice as much.
Yeah.
No, it's just, it's like, it's such a mind-blowing amount of money that's concentrated. And that's obviously a whole different industry, but you could compare apples to apples pretty easily there.
We're in an era of unprecedented concentration of wealth and ownership across the board. And Mr. Zuckerberg, by the way, all that money he's enjoying, the vast majority of it came out of the pocket of my business, which is print journalism. It's a monopoly story as well. Basically, Facebook and Google captured the advertising industry, and it's all under the house of those shops. It's basically controlled by Facebook or Google, and Amazon. And so it's just the concentration of wealth, taking that money out of community newspapers, metro newspapers who used to be able to sell advertising. They own the advertising. And so the wealth is just sucked into the silo of these few firms. And it's almost exactly the same in the meat industry. There used to be tremendous wealth spread throughout rural America, but these companies figured out how to swallow it into their own corporate silo and basically keep the profits for themselves. It's all an issue of monopolies and concentration of wealth.
Yep. All right. So do you see, I guess the last kind of questions I have are just, do you see any hope, any real any reason to be hopeful about these kind of smaller scale poultry processing in rural areas of Iowa?
Absolutely. I mean, totally. Um, I'm hopeful. I'm extremely hopeful about the future for three reasons. I mean, the first is that there's a changing mindset around food, and it's been changing for a long time, but there's this real appreciation, I think, that's growing for getting high quality food from a local producer. I mean, back when I was in college in the late 90s and my wife sold at the local farmers market in Columbia, Missouri, that whole idea was more this kind of niche idea that how great it is to buy directly from the farmer. That is such a much more popular idea now. And people are really getting disaffected with the food system more and more. And so when you see, again, this kind of entrepreneurial energy in rural America of smart producers carving out their own path, connecting with more and more of these consumers that want to do that, that's great. And the more it works, the more appetite there will be for it. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, I think it's like hugely promising. And to my mind, the wind is at its back in the sense that there's more and more awareness and consciousness about food and the quality of food and the importance of local production. I don't see that trend going away at all. And so I'm super hopeful about that. The second thing I'm hopeful about is the growing consciousness around monopolies and antitrust reform. I mean, the picture today is completely different than it was when Barack Obama was elected president in '08 for the first time. Um, the problems of monopolies cannot be ignored. Um, and lawmakers in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are waking up to this. I've just seen things in the antitrust world today that are shocking to me, like a hardcore Republican like Josh Hawley talking about competition and complaining about Tyson's market power, to on the Democrat side a woman like Lena Khan, who's this antitrust thinker, getting appointed to be head of the Federal Trade Commission under Biden. That was crazy. So we're seeing a huge change. And just the third thing that gives me a lot of encouragement is the growing consciousness around these issues in our country, both on food and on the realization that the structure of markets really matters. That, in the 90s, there was just a cult of worship around millionaires and billionaires. And that's really changing now, where people are like, wait a minute, um, just to the point you made, is that natural and healthy for one person like Zuckerberg to be worth more than like the entire market for, was it eggs in this country or poultry?
Chicken,
Chicken. And
poultry.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like,
Like twice, he's worth like twice as much as the what 2 million people are making.
and people are like waking up to this. It's really surprising. I mean, and again, it's not partisan. It's across the landscape. So, and that's in my mind the biggest component of the whole thing is the changing consciousness of the people, because it's really only political power that can start to solve these problems and ordinary people pushing for solutions. So those things encourage me a lot. And I'll tell you what, having studied this stuff, things were awful in this regard in the United States around like 1907. I mean, you had these huge monopolies that controlled everything. Working conditions were awful. There was, the middle class was tiny, and people changed things. I mean, people can change things. And so we've been in bad positions before, and the democratic system, God bless it, can like unleash a lot of power to change things. And once people get fed up, they tend to change things. And so I'm actually pretty hopeful that things can change again.